Hi everyone, this is Waves, and I'm going to take us through P4 Frost BiS so that we can prepare ourselves to storm the icy citadel of the Lich King.
Yes! 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 Yes!
As a quick overview of what I'm going to be covering, I'm going to start out talking about armor pen and gemming. When are we going to change our gems over? I'm also going to talk about P4 progression and BiS from P3, starting first with the non-tier gear and then the tier gear. And finally, I'm going to give a brief primer on what we can expect in P5. Before I begin and get into the BiS lists, I wanted to say a few words about armor pen. Armor pen is our most important stat in ICC. And luckily in ICC, we get a lot of it because armor pen, unlike attack power or spell power, does not scale linearly, it scales exponentially. So when you have not very much of it, it's not as useful to you. As you get closer to the armor pen cap, which is about 1400, then it becomes a very useful stat. If you want to learn more about armor pen, I would suggest checking out Table Slam's excellent primer on armor pen. It's from a feral perspective, but it's totally worth a watch, and I'll have a link in the description of the video. So at P3 BiS, we only have about 248, 250 armor pen, which is not very much. So at 248 armor pen, you'll notice that the relative value of armor pen compared to another stat like strength is not as good. So strength, still better than armor pen. This changes though as you get more and more armor pen. For most classes, the breakpoint where armor pen becomes better than your primary stat is about 500 to 600. However, that's not true with Death Knights because of all of our talents that give us so much value out of strength. For us, it comes around 700 to 800 armor pen. And you can see that if you change your gear. In this case, I'm going to look at a Frost P4 progression I'll comment on later. At 814 armor pen, if I then run the stat weights, you'll then notice that at this point, strength and armor pen are both very similar in the benefit that you get from them. So it's around 800 armor pen that you would completely switch over from using strength gems to using armor pen gems. Also when you would start using armor pen food versus strength food. And finally, if we look at our P4 BiS, where we've got basically the armor cap and then run our stat weight, you'll notice armor pen, we're getting a ton more value out of it than strength. One other thing that I wanted to point out as an important and very useful item, which is called the Crystal Yield. So this is an item that comes from Ungoro. There's a really great Simonized video about it. And when you're getting closer to BiS, this item will give you about 80 DPS. It's used for the whole raid though. So all of your physical DPS dealers are going to increase their DPS by about 60 to 80 DPS if you're using crystal yields on your target. So with that out of the way, let's move on to BiS lists. Okay, so let's start with the non-tier slots. Your BiS is in blue, white has progression or near BiS. So starting with your neck, Lanithiel's Chain of Flagellation is your BiS. Wrists, Tosk's maximized wrist guards. So both of these are kind of unique in the sense that they're both a lot of armor pen, and they end up being pretty terrible right off the bat. So in the beginning, your Onyx neck and your Polar Bear Claw bracers are much better because they have strength and you don't have to worry about armor pen scaling. On the main hand and offhand, your Blood Venom blades are terrific pieces. They not only start out the gate strong, but in fact in your offhand, depending on your end of P4 gearing, your Blood Venom blade in some ways is better than Havoc's Call in the offhand. As a belt, Cold Wraith Lynx is your best belt with Flesh Shaper's Gurney as a progression piece. And then when it comes to cloaks, your 272 TOGC Strength Cloak is the best. However, the Might of the Ocean Serpent, which is your emblem cloak, is pretty close if you pair it with Polar Bear wrists. And if you do that, you don't have to worry about Tosks, which is a pretty contested leather item. Some other items of note, Cindergosa's Cruel Claw as a neck also has good armor pen, but it has agility, and it's going to be highly contested by a bunch of other classes. In terms of weapons, Gut Ripper is the best thing before Blood Venom Blade. You've also got Frost Giant's Cleaver and Blood Venom Blade normal. Your Soulbreaker and Havoc's Call just aren't nearly as good as the other options. So I want to point out again, with both the wrists and the neck, your BiS pieces, if you're looking at it coming from P3, are not that good. In fact, Chain of Flagellation is a DPS downgrade over Hodier's. But once you get to P4, it's a pretty massive spike. And that's again because of the armor pen scaling that I talked about earlier. Your Blood Venom Blade ends up being the single best DPS item you can get for progression in the beginning. And the Havoc's Call is only about 100 DPS upgrade over that. However, if you compare it to P3, it's huge. Alright, moving on. Your best boots are the Blood-Soaked Serenite Stompers off of Death Whisper. So those are going to be pretty easy to get early on. However, honorable mentions are the Bone Drake's boots and even the Hell Frozen Bone Grinders, which shout out to Tyler from the DK Discord for bringing those great boots to my attention. In terms of rings, your absolute best ring is your Might of Blight, Rotface 25 Heroic. No question. Your second best ring is the Ashen Band of Might, so that's your Ashen Verdict Reputation ring. Now, at Honored, depending on if you're in full P3 BiS, it starts becoming slightly better or on par with some of the P3 BiS rings, but definitely Revered, that's when you get the proc, the equip proc on the ring. And the ring gives you some very important hit that you need when you're getting to P4 BiS. Now, trinket-wise, Death's Choice / Death's Verdict is your best first trinket, and then your second best trinket is Deathbringer's Will. So that comes off of Sourfang 25 Heroic. This is going to be very contested. And one of the problems is if you're coming from Mjolnir's Runestone, you're going to find very quickly you will hit a point where the proc of Mjolnir takes you over the armor pen cap. And over time, it's going to be a massive DPS loss to keep Mjolnir's Runestone. So it's important to look at some of the other options. Even if you can get your hands on a Deathbringer's Will normal, that's great. Whispering Fanged Skull is also a pretty good option. That's also contested, but not nearly as much as Deathbringer's Will. In terms of rings, you've got the Skeleton Lord Circle, Rotface's Rupturing Ring, that's an armor pen ring. Even Might of Blight is good. Sourfang's Cold Forged Band is another armor pen ring. And then the Thrice Fang Signet, it's a haste ring, but it's also still pretty good. Now, looking at some of the details, I wanted to point out Deathbringer's Will compared to Mjolnir's. So if you look at this right here, P4 to P3 DPS BiS. So this is coming from Mjolnir's. You'll notice that when you're at full BiS, you're basically at armor pen cap. Mjolnir's is a nearly 900 DPS difference from Deathbringer's Will, because at that point the proc is worth nothing. You're just getting the crit or base stat crit. And you'll notice too a couple of other things, that your Bone Drakes is decent, but the Blood-Soaked Serenite Stompers, unlike your wrists and neck, are an upgrade both at BiS and in the beginning. Just not as much compared to BiS. Let's talk tier. So I'm going to go over BiS, and then I'm going to talk about progression. Chest, shoulders, head. You go with tier. There's really no other option. 251, 264, 277, it doesn't matter, you go with tier. You have a little bit of leeway in terms of hands versus legs. So your BiS hands are going to be your tier 10, but there is the option of using Aldriana's Gloves of Secrecy. If you go with the Gloves of Secrecy, then obviously you're going to go with the tier 10 legs. And at BiS, they're actually pretty equivalent to what I have as BiS, so that's tier 10 hands and then leggings of Etheric Strife. However, getting to BiS, you're going to be doing far less damage if you go the T10 legs route. Now, in terms of your off-piece legs, Etheric Strife is the best. Your leg plates of Painful Death, however, are also really good. And even the Scourge Reaver's leg plates. Now, while Painful Death and Etheric Strife have armor pen, your Scourge Reaver leg plates are 277, have more strength, and that's what kind of brings them close and up to your Painful Death and Etheric Strife. In fact, if you are able to get your hands on Scourge Reaver's leg plates, they actually become BiS in P5. So what pieces should we take? When should we take them? That's the big question that everybody has, right? So T10 is so good. And in the beginning, it's not really because of the stats, it's because of the set bonuses. It's so good, in fact, that even if you have P3, so T9 BiS, T9 Heroic, you're still going to replace it with T10 251 as soon as you get your first two pieces. Best pieces to start with are your head and your chest. Next, you go shoulders, and of course, if you're going with using non-tier legs, you would grab the hands. So if you're starting out, or if you're measuring progression, this is where using the Etheric Strife ends up being your best bet. Painful Death is close, Scourge Reaver after that, but if you go the T10 legs route, this is where you see a huge drop-off. So 277 legs are actually worse than 258 legs at full P3 BiS. And so that's why I say that if you get to BiS in the end of ICC and you have the T10 legs with Aldriana's, it actually works. And in that case, you would need the Polar Bear bracers for the hit, as well as an offhand Blood Venom Blade. You wouldn't even go for an offhand Havoc's Call. But getting there, you're going to do significantly less damage until you get to that BiS at the end. That's why I would recommend you just go with head, chest, shoulders, hands, and then grab one of these other off pieces. These pieces are going to be a lot easier to get than Aldriana's, which is going to be hugely contested by other classes. Okay, let's bring this all together. So let me talk about first what P4 Frost Progression looks like. So here's a couple of pieces that I think are easier to get in the beginning. So in here I have all the 251 pieces. I've got your Onyx Net Guard from Lady Death Whisper. I've got your Blood Venom Blade on the main hand from Sourfang. Frost Giant's Cleaver, assuming you didn't get a second Blood Venom Blade. This is coming from Gunship, 10-man Heroic. Then you've got Flesh Shaper's Gurney from 10-man Rotface. Painful Death Leggings, which are the Blacksmith Leggings. And you've got your Bone Drake's Enameled Boots, again from Gunship. Rotface's Rupturing Ring. Here I just have the Revered Ashen Verdict. You should be able to get to at least Revered by about a month. And we're saying that you got lucky and got Deathbringer's Will. So all of this together, you're looking at, above P3 BiS, nearly 1500 DPS upgrade over your P3 BiS. And that's just with 251 gear. We really are going to skyrocket early on in this phase. And another important thing of note is even in this progression piece, I already have 774 armor pen. So as I said at the beginning of the video, this is about the time that I would consider switching all of my gems to armor pen. In fact, if I do that, I'm going to jump up to 1176, and you can see that it's just starting to show a difference, switching all of my gems to armor pen. This is also the time that if I were to still be using Mjolnirs, I would be in real trouble, because it's going to be a huge DPS loss at this point. So if you still have Mjolnirs by, about a month in, this is when you want to think about some other options. So even Greatness, you're going to see a bigger jump compared to Mjolnirs. It's still a loss, obviously, over Deathbringers, but not nearly as much as Mjolnirs. And again, all of these pieces are pieces that come from easier bosses earlier on, whether that be in 10-man or 25-man. Okay, so let's look at full BiS. What does full BiS look like? So, as I said earlier, we actually have a couple of different options. So on the one hand, we have Havoc's Call in the main hand with a Blood Venom Blade offhand. We're in full tier 10 heroic. We've got Flagellation. We have Tosks, Cold Wraith. We have our Etheric Strife, Might of Blight, and then of course Deathbringer's Will and Death's Choice. But this is kind of your first option, and this is an easier option to get. You'll notice I only have one Havoc's Call. Another example is where you've got two Havoc's Calls. If you're using two Havoc's Calls, you're going to switch to Polar Bear Claw Bracers. And it's not quite as good, but it's still within the margin of error. You then also have this other option, which is to use Aldriana's, your T10 legs, still with the Polar Bear Claw Bracers, and Blood Venom Blade offhand. In this case, you need that Blood Venom Blade offhand in order to have the extra hit. And this one's even slightly better than your Etheric. I mean, just barely in this case. It's not even noticeable. But as I said earlier, this is a harder gearing setup to get to. You're sacrificing along the way, taking the 10 leggings, and then you're going for a more difficult gloves. Finally, I just want to bring up one other idea or example, and that is if you're over here with your Etheric Strife, but let's say you don't have Garrosh's Rage, or you weren't able to get Tosk's Wrist Guards, you'll notice that if I switch to the Might of Ocean Serpent, and then switch this to your Polar Bear Claw Bracers, it's pretty similar. I mean, the difference is pretty negligible, only 21 DPS difference. So if you weren't able to get your 272 Cloak, really it's not going to be that big of a deal as you get closer to BiS. And you also get the expertise rating from it, which is a nice little bonus. Okay, now I want to finish up talking a little bit about P5. So we don't know when P5 is going to come out, but Blizzard has hinted that it'll come out pretty soon, like in 3 months. And so I wanted to give you a little preview of it so you could start thinking about some of the gearing. So here we are with one of the variations of P4 BiS. We've got an offhand Blood Venom Blade, we've got our 272 Cloak, etc. So there are 3 main pieces that you could or should take depending in P5. So the first one is Penumbra Pendant. That's the neck off of Hellion. Then we've got the boots, Apocalypse's Advance, and then we have STS. So in this change, we've changed the neck, boots, and trinket. We now have dual Havoc's Calls, and we've got our 272 Cloak with Tosks. This setup right here really only works for orcs, and that's because as we get closer to P5, expertise becomes more important. And as you can see right now, as a troll, or many of the other races don't have the expertise, so it doesn't sim as good. The alternative is then if you're not orc. So this does work if you're an orc, it's not as great, but the alternative is actually to use Scourge Reaver legs instead of Etheric, mostly because we would have too much armor pen. We stick with Lanathiel's Chain of Flagellation because of the expertise. We switch to the Might of the Ocean Serpent and have Polar Bear Claw Bracers. Simming that gets us to 15,903. An alternative is to actually use those tier 10 legs. So if we use the tier 10 legs, this allows us to keep the 272 Cloak, and we can use the neck from Hellions. And it ends up being slightly better, about 50 DPS difference. If you did go the T10 route, which allowed you to get Aldriana's, now you can more effectively use that Penumbra Pendant. But this takes me back to what's the easiest thing to do? And honestly, it's just to keep your Lanathiels, grab the Might of the Ocean Serpent, which is an emblem cloak, and then stick with the Polar Bear Claw Bracers. Now, there's a very good chance that a lot of guilds out there are not going to have killed the Lich King by the time P5 comes out. In that case, if you've still got your Blood Venom Blades, you can still rock Tosks. You use the Might of the Ocean Serpent, you've got Lanathiels, and one of the changes you actually make is that in this case where you've got 2 Blood Venom Blades, you would actually switch out a bunch of your armor pen for strength because you're at cap. Blood Venom Blades are going to bring you above the cap. That's just something I wanted to point out if you're a guild that has not killed the Lich King yet. When P5 drops and you're able to start farming it and you get your STS and maybe your Apocalypse Advance, this is what you would do. You would re-gem some of your armor pen gems down. Okay, well, we've covered a lot, and I want to thank you all for bearing with me as I've gone through P4 BiS for Frost DKs. Couple of quick shout outs and thank yous. Shout out to the DK Discord, Ebb and Hold. I invite all of you, if you're not a part of it, to check it out, join it. Fonzas has created an incredible community there. You can find me on there. I'm there to answer any questions that you have. And good luck in the upcoming phase.
What are you waiting for? A kiss?